But I'm really psyched to be going around and giving these talks with Matt, and I'd like to start out by explaining to you why I think our collaboration is important and why this issue of science communication is important. And I'm going to do a bit of personal narrative at the outset to show you how I've gotten to where I am. In 2005, I published this book, The Republican War on Science, and at the outset of talks, I do like to disclose to my listeners that there was no conscious intention on the part of the illustrator here to construct a visual pun which turns upon my last name and the image of the elephant. So we really only noticed that later. And also, we weren't trying to echo the cover image of another popular book that you may or may not be familiar with. So the book was well received. It sold well, and I, as any writer with a book tends to do, headed out on the road to talk to audiences about the subject. And when I did so, in my speeches, I unveiled a by now familiar litany of abuses by the Bush administration against science, some of them pretty egregious, things like this: an internal Environmental Protection Agency memo in which scientists at the EPA are complaining that the White House has made major edits to the climate change section of the EPA's report on the environment, indicating that, quote, no further changes may be made. And down at point 2, the EPA scientists are saying the White House's changes have been so extensive that the report no longer accurately represents scientific consensus on climate change. So this is the epitome of political interference with science, political people telling the scientists what to say and telling them to say something that's wrong. Unfortunately, there was a lot of this kind of thing in the Bush administration. So I'd give talks outlining all these kinds of abuses and misbehaviors, and my audience by the end was pretty ticked off by all this stuff, and then all the hands would go up. And they would say, okay, you've made me really angry, really frustrated, you made me want to punch a wall, you haven't given me any release. What can I do about this problem of science abuse? And I quickly realized that my instinctual answer to that question, which was, oh, just buy the book, was probably not sufficient. So I started thinking about more constructive solutions to deal with this broad science, politics, society gap, which was at the core of what I was writing about. So I proposed solutions touching upon government policy. You know, let's strengthen congressional science advice. I proposed solutions turning upon the role of the media, because there's a lot of problems with the way journalists treat science. There's the problem of 50-50 balance, so constructing a phony debate even when one doesn't exist within the world of science in your media coverage, and giving equal weight to to scientific perspectives or scientific sounding perspectives that have not, in fact, have much publication strength behind them. And it's not just the way the press covers science, but the volume of attention to science in the first place is an issue. So most journalists, I think, would much rather cover something like this than a scientific topic. And you may say to yourself, well, this looks at least vaguely scientific because it resembles a UFO, and at least we might, you know, sounds like sci-fi, but we all know this is Britney Spears, and when Britney Spears shaved her head, I think that if you ask the average person on the street whether they know about that as opposed to whether they know that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released its latest report, you can imagine what the answer is going to be. And then the third issue area where I wanted to propose some solutions involved the way that scientists themselves attempt to communicate through the media to the broader public. And oddly, this was the most controversial suggestion. But my experience on writing on science and politics had slowly taught me that there are some rules of scientific research which are pretty well understood. The rules of peer review, winning over consensus of experts to your position, reproducibility of data, all these kinds of things. We know these very well. These are the rules of knowledge creation. But the problem that I was addressing in Republican War on Science was something very different. It wasn't creating high-quality scientific research, but rather we already had that research, but we were trying to translate it into policy action, or we were trying to win broader public acceptance for something that isn't controversial within the scientific community. And knowledge translation turns out to be a much trickier problem in some ways in creating knowledge in the first place, because you have to know something about how the public's mind works, you have to know something about how the media works, and these can be quirky at best, or even at sometimes not entirely rational. But nevertheless, translating knowledge is going to be more crucial than ever going forward as more and more of decision-making relies upon scientific information if we're going to get the best policies, the best results. In this context, I don't think scientists are going to be able to stay out of politics, but in order to adapt, scientists are going to have to learn that when they get out of debating in the peer-reviewed literature and start debating within the political arena, start debating within the context of the mass media, there are very different rules of the game, and scientists are too often unaware of how this actually works. If you'll permit an analogy, let's say that when you're debating a scientific subject within the peer-reviewed literature, the rules are something like this. Let's say they're boxing rules. You can punch, but only above the belt. When a scientific issue gets politicized, starts being discussed in that context by advocates, by politicians, and so forth, then suddenly you might start getting a kick as well. When a scientific issue is not only politicized, but is the subject of mass media coverage, let's say a feeding frenzy, then there are no rules, and it's ultimate fighting. Scientists, I think, have to awaken to these realities of how the media works. And at this point in my intellectual journey, which was sort of kicked off by my first talks on politics and science, I was fortunate to have a friend and colleague dating back to my very first internship out of college, Matt Nisbet. It was almost 10 years ago, and I'd since gone on to become a journalist. Matt had actually gotten a PhD. And his research focuses on what we know from 60 years of social science work about how the public makes up its mind on political controversies and then applies that research to scientific controversies. That's Matt's innovation, assuming that they may not actually be all that different than political controversies. And Matt's work on framing in particular seemed very relevant to me. I thought it offered some important solutions to this problem, this broad problem of knowledge translation. We've got the information, but why can't we get people to accept it? Why can't we get politicians to use it? And this ultimately led to our joint April 6th piece in Science, which I've passed out copies of. So I'd now like to call on Matt to explain some of the problems with many of the core assumptions that scientists bring to them when they try to communicate with the broader public.
Well, in our policy forum piece at Science, what we really wanted to set out to do is really challenge some of the assumptions that people have about what makes for effective science communication with the broader American public by way of the mass media. And again, in this talk and the talks that we're giving in different places across the country, we're really trying to start a national conversation about new directions in science communication, and part of that conversation is, in fact, sort of boldly challenging various assumptions that people have about, again, effective science communication. So kind of the dominant assumptions about effective science communication with the broader American public is really kind of what I call the popular science model or the science literacy model. And the assumption here is if the public knew more about the technical side of science, then the public would view issues as scientists do, and there would be fewer controversies. So the emphasis here is, of course, on traditional science education, which remains very important, but especially on popular science by way of the mass media, popular science magazines, PBS Nova specials, and really the icon or the symbol of this model is Carl Sagan. So oftentimes when controversies over climate change, when controversies over stem cell research occur, you'll hear people say rhetorically over and over again, what we really need are more Carl Sagans. What we really need to do is increase the scientific literacy of the public. If we only had more scientific literacy, then these problems would go away. There's a couple of problems with those assumptions, or in fact that model. The first problem is that it actually doesn't fit with what we know about how average members of the public go about making daily decisions about both personal and political questions in their lives. Faced with a daily torrent of information, most members of the public lack both the motivation and the ability to keep up with most issues. So I like to call most members of the public instead cognitive misers. It's a term from social psychology. Everyone looks for information shortcuts or heuristics to get on with their days and make sense of the very complex, often uncertain scientific debates that they may be encountered by way of the mass media or called up upon a survey and asked to give a judgment or an opinion. And of course, in modern political campaigns and from research on political campaigns, we know in fact actually that the public indeed looks and relies upon information shortcuts in making up their minds about political candidates and political issues such as abortion. The first thing they do is they rely very heavily on just their social background to make these decisions. So they rely heavily on the religious identity, their ideology, their partisanship, and then political campaigns, presidential campaigns and issue campaigns, most notably, for example, the 2004 election and the President Bush's campaign, they provide different types of heuristics or shortcuts that play on these individual citizen biases. So President Bush's campaign in 2004 understood that the public was unlikely to make up their minds about who to vote for based on the specifics of their policy positions. Instead, they're going to rely very heavily on heuristics such as likability, personality, and presidential or candidate character. So the internal kind of memo, strategy memo that read for the Bush campaign was, if he doesn't live your life, share your values, or someone you'd want to have a beer with, then he shouldn't be your president. Again, playing on character and likability as important heuristics in choosing a president. On the other hand, the Kerry campaign had a very different type of assumption. They really focused heavily on the issues. And their internal memo read as JHOS, jobs, healthcare, oil, and national security. The other thing that the popular science model doesn't really fit with is not only the human nature in terms of everyone being a cognitive miser looking for information shortcuts to get through their daily lives, but it doesn't also fit with the nature of a fragmented media system. So let me give you an example. Back in 1985, and this is an example from a recent book out from a political scientist at Princeton, Marcus Pryor, if you sat down at 6 o'clock to watch TV, you only really had 3 choices available to you. All of those, well, actually 4 choices. All of those choices involved public affairs news, either the 3-network TV broadcasts or PBS News. If you sat down in 2007 to watch TV today, you have more than 300 cable channels available to you. And what this means is that choice actually becomes a problem. Because for the average member of the public, if they lack the preference for public affairs or scientific content, they can easily select themselves out of the audience for that information and pays very close attention instead to things like celebrity culture, infotainment, or lean very heavily on their ideology and only pay attention to those news channels or those shows that resonate with their ideological background. So instead of being fully informed, how is it that the miserly public makes up their mind? Well, as I already mentioned, they lean very heavily on their social background, their religious identity, their ideology, their partisanship to make sense of scientific topics and public affairs topics. But they also rely very heavily on just those images or those interpretations of an issue that are most readily available out there in mass media coverage. Now, social scientists studying the influence of the media over time have come up with a term for this, and this is called framing effects. And very briefly, you can think of a frame as organizing central ideas on an issue. They endow certain dimensions of a complex topic with greater apparent relevance than the same dimensions might appear to have under an alternative frame. Importantly, frames help communicate why an issue might be a problem, who or what might be responsible, and what should be done. And second, these underlying meanings, these interpretations, are often instantly communicated in shorthand by way of things like catchphrases, slogans, images, historical references, metaphors, references to literature, cartoons, and other types of graphic displays. Journalists rely very heavily on frames all the time. This is how journalists are able to file a story under a tight deadline and condense a story down in its complexity to just 800 words in a way that resonates with their audiences. So as Chris and I will talk about coming up, this is one reason why science writers and political journalists often define the same issue in very different ways. They have different backgrounds in how they approach the story, but they're also writing for very different audience groups. Citizens, as cognitive misers, rely on frames all the time to make sense of complex topics. And importantly, to make up their minds about an issue, oftentimes in the absence of knowledge. And not only making up their minds in the absence of knowledge, but also to express their opinion or articulate what they believe to others, again with very little information. Finally, citizens oftentimes accept only those frames, interpretations of an issue that match their social background, their religious identity, their ideology, their partisanship. Finally, scientists use frames all the time too. Frames are embedded as part of the human communication process. Right? So when a scientist tries to communicate the specifics of the research findings to a specialist in another field, they define the issue in a way that resonates with the background of that non-specialist. When you write a grant proposal as a scientist, you're writing for that specific audience, that grantor, and you're accenting certain dimensions of your research or its implications over others, reducing down complexity. And in fact, when you put together a PowerPoint presentation, that in itself is an exercise in framing. What's interesting is if you go back through research, you actually can begin to identify a generalizable set of frames or latent meanings, categories of interpretations that appear to span across science-related policy debates. And these interpretations or frames were first described in a classic study in the American Journal of Sociology by William Gamson, a sociologist at Boston College, and subsequently published and then further developed in studies of not nuclear energy, but applied to the controversies over biotechnology in the United States and some research that I've done with colleagues, and then across Europe by researchers at the London School of Economics. And as Chris and I will present tonight, we believe that the same category of frames applies to other issues such as stem cell research, teaching of evolution in schools, and climate change. Okay, very briefly, this set of kind of general categories probably rings familiar with you. Oftentimes, social progress and economic development are two selective interpretations of science that have promoted science historically, especially in the post-war period in the United States. On the other hand, when a technology like nuclear energy, or even things like plant biotechnology or nanotechnology is opposed, interpreted in negative ways, it's framed as a Frankenstein's monster, a Pandora's box of unknown disaster. And throughout this presentation, we'll again apply these different generalizable meanings to different types of debates, such as climate change, stem cell research, and the teaching of evolution. And we'll come back to this framework at the end. Finally, you can think about research and framing and its implications like a communication technology. You can actually think of it similar to nuclear energy. In the wrong hands, nuclear energy can be used for bad purposes. But in fact, actually, if you understand the research on framing and you recast issues in ways that remain true to the science, but connect those issues in meaningful ways to a broader American public, it can be used for very good outcomes. So those outcomes could include motivating interest and attention to an issue among a wider American public that otherwise might be disinterested, creating messages in media that go beyond the current polarization that's out there in news coverage, given the particular issue, shaping preferences for policies that might be informed by science. You can use framing, in fact, to connect a complicated issue to the social background of an audience group and thereby generate more trust with that audience group. And then finally, you can use framing to shape personal choices about health or in the environment, or political choices about who to vote for, or or a proposition ballot, et cetera.
So as you might imagine, when I heard Matt explain for the first time how we're all cognitive misers, how we make decisions in the absence of information, and how we are therefore susceptible to framing, a kind of light bulb went on for me, and I saw a lot of the scientific issues that I had written about suddenly in a very different light. And let's take evolution as an example. To defend evolution in my books, in my talks, I had perhaps somewhat naively tried to rely upon rational argumentation. So I would go on and on about the vast interlocking body of evidence from diverse fields that together collectively supports the consensus of evolutionary science. And I would also skewer the intelligent design creationists for their attack on, quote, scientific naturalism, which is science's reliance upon natural explanations rather than invoking supernatural causes for phenomena. And I would accuse the intelligent design proponents of trying to turn scientists into something much more like these guys, you know, sending scientists on a wild goose chase after the supernatural, when in fact we know in reality no scientist has ever discovered ectoplasm or been slimed by a ghost. And this was all well and good. I was talking largely to audiences who agreed with me. It was easy to make these points and to have them resonate, but it began to dawn on me as well that these kinds of arguments clearly were not getting through to the broader American public. I already knew that Gallup polls, taken with the same language over decades, had consistently found that roughly 46% of the American public agrees with the following statement. God created human beings pretty much in the present form at one time within the last 10,000 years or so. Those numbers haven't moved, and evolution is one of the least contested areas of science. Clearly, the facts alone are not enough, in this case, to compel acceptance. And why is that? Well, as Matt said, people are self-selecting their information sources, and the ones who don't accept the scientific consensus on evolution are not selecting scientific information sources. They're hearing from their neighbors, they're hearing from their ministers, their church leaders, they're hearing from the conservative media, and these issues are being framed for them in a very different way. That's the background understanding for the American public on evolution, which is troubling enough, but now watch what happens when evolution becomes a subject of major controversy and media coverage, as happened in 2005 in association with the fights in Kansas, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Matt and I wrote a piece about this for Columbia Journalism Review, and sure enough, there was an explosion in media coverage because the issues were suddenly controversial and being covered in a political and legal context. And at that point, the people covering evolution ceased to be just science reporters who understood the scientific information. Rather, the evolution story was kicked to a number of different beats, especially political beats, and all kinds of problems with media coverage ensued, not the least of them being phony balance. So on ABC Nightline, we got a, quote, debate between an evolution defender and an intelligent design proponent. This was the kind of thing that was happening. And in this context of mass media coverage, the proponents of intelligent design cleverly sought to frame the issue. And the frame that they used was one that resonated heavily with core American ideals of fairness and freedom of opportunity. They said, teach the controversy. Teach the controversy over evolution. Let students hear both sides and then let them make up their mind. And they tried to define their position as a middle way between teaching only evolutionary science, which they said was tantamount to inculcating children in the doctrine of atheism, on the one hand, and teaching creationism, which the Supreme Court had already made illegal. And this was a middle way frame, but there was also a second frame, which Matt and I would define as scientific uncertainty, and that involved technical attacks on evolutionary science and claiming that the scientific establishment was itself oppressive and was trying to keep down the innovative, intelligent design proponents who were, in fact, modern-day Galileos. Let's look at how the public was responding to the kinds of messages they were hearing. Matt took a poll asking, do you agree or disagree that either evolution or intelligent design is based on an overwhelming body of scientific evidence? And when you polled people, almost as many strongly agreed or agreed that intelligent design was based on an overwhelming body of scientific evidence as agreed that evolution was based on an overwhelming body of scientific evidence. So the public didn't know which was science. And then when you asked them about policy, you know, do you think we should teach only evolution, or do you think intelligent design should be taught as an alternative? Then across demographic groups, pretty much every group, these are the red bars, said they did support teaching intelligent design as an alternative. That fairness idea really resonated, and the only group for whom it didn't resonate, although there was still strong support, was the people professing no religion, where evolution only actually won. How did scientists respond to this really clever public relations campaign? Well, there were a number of strategies. Some of them may not have been entirely strategic, but certainly one instinctual response of scientists, certainly when faced with the scientific uncertainty frame, was to argue back on the science. After all, this is what scientists know about. But there's a problem with that technique. It's technical, it's off-putting to many members of the public, and when you argue back against the intelligent design movement's attack on science, then they, in turn, would further argue about the science, and the frame would still be uncertainty to anyone who was trying to make sense of it and just heard two scientific-sounding, expert-sounding people going at it. So arguing over the science was, in fact, a trap. There was another approach, conscious or otherwise, on the part of some scientists that was really well captured in the great documentary Flock of Dodos by Randy Olson, which I think is going to be airing on Showtime soon. And what he captured was the state of Kansas and the evolution fight happening there. That Olson never doubted in his documentary that evolution was accepted within the world of science, but when he went around and sort of covered this, he found something surprising. The evolution defenders were angry. They didn't have a communications campaign. What they had was their outrage, and it was epitomized by the scene at the poker table in this documentary, which I really encourage you to watch, where one evolution defender, when asked how he's going to communicate on this issue, says, you know, I think people have to stand up and say, you're an idiot. That was... And by contrast, the intelligent design people, they might have been wrong, but they were really nice people. You wanted to go over to their house and eat corn on the cob and go for a ride on the tractor. And he really captured this in the documentary. So evolutionists weren't putting good public face forward, and sometimes they were hurting themselves even more by mixing up their defense of evolution with attacks on religion. And Richard Dawkins, I think, is the epitome of this. He is one of our leading defenders of evolution. He is also now one of our leading proponents of atheism. And attacking religion, whatever else you might say about it, does not appeal to core American values. The media covers it as conflict, as you can see here, God versus science. It turns off a large bulk of the American public, and it also reaffirms a stereotype held by many religious conservatives, which is that evolution is an attack on their faith, and there you are going around attacking their faith. So Matt and I would propose some different communication approaches on evolution. The first one is, let's get that social progress frame working for us. Let's define evolution as laying the groundwork for medical advances, laying the groundwork for a better understanding of bird flu. Let's try to have a middle way approach of our own, explaining that many religious scientists, many religious leaders actually have no problem with evolution. Many average citizens of faith have no problem with evolution. There is a middle way here. And finally, let's try a public accountability frame, which is what I think worked for us so well in Dover, Pennsylvania. And the narrative here would go something like this. A small group of religious conservatives took control of the school board and tried to push their narrow religious view on a community of diverse faiths, and that's wrong. But a Republican judge and a Bush appointee exposed that corruption in a landmark legal opinion. And if you want to make this a really appealing message, you can add that the judge is even good-looking. And in fact, after his 130-plus page technical legal opinion in the Dover Evolution trial, Wired magazine named him one of the sexiest geeks of 2005. So the evolution fight is now died down, but American history suggests that it will flare up again soon enough. It always does. It's always with us, and I think the question is whether we'll be better able to frame our message the next time around.
Okay, moving from evolution to the stem cell debate and how framing and different types of communication strategies have moved public opinion over time. And really the stem cell debate is actually a success story in how a coalition of scientists and patient advocates and others marshaled the resources and really shaped policy preferences on this issue to overturn Bush's compromise decision in 2001. Well, first, how is the public making sense of the complicated nature of the stem cell debate? Well, the first thing is they're not necessarily relying on knowledge, because in fact, knowledge of the specifics of the science or the policy debate remains very low, despite record amounts of media attention to a scientific topic. Perhaps only climate change has received more media attention than stem cell research over the last 5 or 6 years. And in fact, probably more, tens of millions of dollars of political ads have also been run on this issue. But based on a survey that I did back in 2005, I wanted to ask people if they had to know just the basic amount of policy and scientific information to make an informed decision, what should they know? So I asked people if they knew about Bush's decision in 2001, his compromise decision. I asked them if they knew what happened in California in 2004 on the Proposition 71 campaign. I asked them in a multiple choice question why they thought scientists think embryonic stem cell research is important. I asked them whether they knew whether or not the federal government actually regulated human cloning. And then finally, I asked them if they knew what the acronym NIH stands for, which roughly only 9% of Americans did. And across those 5 items, the mean scores in terms of knowledge, what I considered to be valid representations of core pieces of knowledge that informed citizens should know, was only 1.8. So in the absence of knowledge, despite record amounts of media attention, how is it that the public is making sense of this issue? Well, one thing they're doing is they're relying very heavily on just those interpretations or frames which are most readily available out there by way of media coverage. And one of the frames that's very available, as I'll talk about, is the social progress interpretation, that research leads to therapies and cures. And here's an interesting example of the effects of that frame. The Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation in 2001 commissioned a poll where they defined in the context of the question the issue very specifically around social progress, talking about how research could lead to cures for diseases such as diabetes, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, and a whole host of other diseases. And not surprisingly, if framed in those positive ways around social progress, 65% of the public supported research. On the other hand, right about the same time, the National Conference of Catholic Bishops commissioned their own survey and framed the issue in the context of the question in a very different light, focusing really on morality and ethics, using language that connected the issue to the issue of abortion. They talked about experiments, the live embryos to be destroyed in the first week of development, and then asked people, do you support or oppose using your federal tax dollars for such experiments? And not surprisingly, if framed in those terms, you get the exact opposite result in terms of public opinion. Both surveys, nationally representative surveys of adults, in this case with the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, roughly 75% of citizens oppose research when framed around morality and ethics. So this is interesting. What this tells me is that subsequently over the next 5 years, whoever won the battle to get their preferred interpretation out there into the wider media coverage, public opinion would probably follow along. So how is this frame contest playing out? Well, these are pictures that were on the news wires after Bush's veto of the legislation last summer that would have overturned his compromise position in 2001. On the left, you can see the proponents of research, when they appear at news conferences, they have placards in the back that emphasize this hope for cures, the social progress interpretation. This is the photo op that's captured and then relayed to Americans instantaneously when they're flipping through the channels on the news or in front page news coverage if these photos ran there. On the other hand, when Bush announced his veto legislation, he posed with so-called snowflake babies. These were babies that were adopted by parents from leftover embryos. And of course, he used the classic politician photo op, posing with a baby, to immediately translate for the wider American public that research involved crossing, in his words, an important moral boundary. And in fact, an embryo, which might be the size of the tip of your pen, is really a human child. And the image on the back, on the bottom, actually appeared on the front page of the Washington Post. And his press conference was covered live by all the cable news networks. Well, if you're a stem cell proponent, the good news is, in fact, actually organizations like the Coalition of Advancement of Medical Research have done a very good job of marshaling resources over the last 5 years and getting their preferred interpretations out there into media attention. And what happens when this information flows there out into the media system? Well, it interacts with citizens' social backgrounds, leading to some type of policy preference outcome. So this is based on a study that I did based on survey data taken in 2001, 2002, and it's a classic interaction effect. For the non-religious to the moderately religious Americans, as I classified in this data, the more they report hearing, reading, or seeing about the issue, given a positive interpretation of social progress, as we'll talk about in a second, economic development, the more they support research. On the other hand, for the third of Americans who are classified as strongly religious, the more they report hearing, reading, or seeing about the issue, their religious identity serves as a very powerful perceptual screen, and their opinion little changes. So what's interesting is, in fact, actually since 2001 and 2002, as information frames about the issue has flowed out there into the media system, and including through political ads, focusing on social progress and economic development, public opinion has moved in slight ways over the last 5 years to about roughly at the aggregate level across all Americans, roughly high 50% support. And importantly, among moderately religious Americans, mainline Protestants, and Catholics, public support for embryonic stem cell research, given a very dominant frame around social progress and economic development, has moved in support roughly 20 percentage points. Even evangelicals over the last year have moved in support, though they still are below majority support for research. And this shows up across several polls, not just the Pew polls that I show you here. Okay, so what role did framing happen in the Proposition 71 campaign in California, what I call How the West Was Won? Well, in that campaign, the organizers of that campaign understood that in a very noisy presidential election season, trying to reach a public that lacked the motivation and the ability to pay attention to the science, it wasn't wise to do two things. One, attack the religious beliefs and tell them that they're stupid for not supporting the science. Or two, hammering home the scientific facts of the research, trying to improve scientific literacy in California, because then support would follow along, as the popular science assumption might be. Instead, they shifted the message and they shifted the messenger, remaining true to the science in most cases, but in fact actually being much more effective in their communication. So they teamed up with actors like Brad Pitt and Michael J. Fox, and these actors very narrowly focused over and over again in sound bites and media appearances on the social progress and economic development frame. And this is just from a transcript of Brad Pitt's appearance on the Today Show to a wider kind of soft news audience that probably respected Brad Pitt as an actor. Katie Couric asked him, Brad Pitt, why do you support this proposition campaign? The first thing he delivers is the social progress frame. It's the extraordinary opportunity we have here to eradicate diseases. And the next two interpretations he delivers are the economic progress frame, economic development frame. Our scientists are going to places like Singapore, and it's hurting our economy here in California. This is not actually a cost, but rather an investment in the future of our economy. Right? He stayed on message and delivered two very important positive interpretations over and over again throughout this interview. And what happened in California? Well, public support for the proposition campaign moved in August from about 45% to just before Election Day, about 55%, and then on Election Day passed with 59% support. How did they do this? Well, they had a very focused message campaign, social progress and economic development. They teamed up, they matched scientists with celebrities, and importantly, the power of money. They spent $20 million on political ads, and the opposition only spent $300,000. So they made the information environment in California almost completely one-sided. around the interpretations of social progress and economic development, and they were able to move public opinion in important ways leading up to the campaign. Now, what happened in California after they passed the Proposition 71 campaign? Well, the pro-life groups that initially opposed it became very smart in their framing. They realized that their pro-life interpretations, their morality interpretations, didn't necessarily resonate with the California public, importantly, that swing public. Instead, they shifted interpretations to focus on public accountability. Their argument went like this. They raised the question, is this science in the public interest, or rather, is this science in the private interest? Is this just feeding the interests of scientists and biotech companies, or is it actually leading to return on taxpayer dollars? And if it's not, who's going to hold the scientists and their institutions accountable? And in the Missouri campaign this last fall, which was a campaign to pass a constitutional amendment protecting the ability of scientists to do stem cell research in Missouri, the pro-life groups who opposed the constitutional amendment used this interpretation, the public accountability interpretation, very effectively, teaming up with celebrities like St. Louis Rams quarterback Kurt Warner to deliver the interpretation that this was actually a constitutional amendment that was going to spend taxpayer dollars to feed private interests, private science, and that's wrong. And they closed the gap in the opinion polls roughly 20 points leading up to the election day, though the constitutional amendment still passed. And they did it mostly through political ads. Okay. Stem cell research is also a very good example of you don't want to go too far in how you selectively interpret science for the public. You always want to remain true to the science, but that doesn't mean that you can't recast it in ways that makes it personally meaningful. Two examples, though, that might have gone too far in how the issue has been framed is one, John Edwards' remarks in 2004 on the campaign trail, where he said that if John Kerry were elected, Christopher Reeve would get up out of a wheelchair and walk again. Again, that's a framing that doesn't do justice to the uncertainties when research and therapies will be available, and maybe a timescale of 20 or 30 years. And then finally, oftentimes, if science gets wrapped up in nationalism, as was the case in Korea, you have frame examples such as this, the therapeutic cloning postage stamp. Again, this is a great example of a frame device, but probably goes too far. It immediately connotes this idea around social progress that research is going to let people walk again. And it's tied very closely to nationalism. Okay, finally, the last case study here, global warming. Global warming is also interesting like stem cell research. Today you have more information available by way of the mass media on global warming than any time in history. This is a graph that plots media attention to the issue of global warming and climate change at the New York Times and the Washington Post over the last 20 years. And what you can see is that actually the up and down swings of media attention don't necessarily follow kind of the linear increase in scientific research that's being produced on the issue, nor does it follow kind of the increasing scientific consensus on the topic as released by the IPCC report. Instead, the peaks in this cycle of attention follow very closely simply the drama of political moments. Until 2006, something else was different that happened in 2006. A confluence of scientific, cultural, and political events happened to make 2006 the all-time high in terms of media attention to the issue. Yet despite growing scientific consensus on the topic, more information available online or by way of media coverage than any time in history, all the poll information, all the poll data shows that the public still remains uncertain about the science and also the specifics of policy issues such as the Kyoto Climate Treaty. And this is just one example. This is surveys that were done by John Krosnick at Stanford University, Windsor, Ohio State in collaboration with ABC. And in these surveys that show, they asked respondents, do most citizens agree global warming is happening, or is there a lot of disagreement? Even in 2007, only 40% of the public says that most scientists agree global warming is happening. So why is this? Again, it's this interaction between people's social background, their ideology, and just those interpretations or frames of the issue that are most readily available out there in media coverage. And here's a great example. This is a strategy memo that was uncovered by Environmental Working Group, and attributed to Frank Luntz, a GOP pollster. And in his strategy memo, based on focus group and survey work, he argues that the best way to talk about this issue, right, to downplay the urgency of the issue in any type of policy action, is to first frame it around scientific uncertainty. The scientific debate remains open. And then second, frame it around the idea that any policy action is an unfair economic burden. Why? Because countries like India and China are not playing along and also taking policy action. And what do you see out there in the mass media? You see conservative leaders like James Inhofe, the former chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, following this playbook very closely. For example, the week that the first IPCC report was released earlier this year, he appeared on Fox and Friends unchallenged and argued over and over again in that interview to a politically like-minded audience of Fox News viewers that, in fact, don't believe the IPCC report because the science still remains open, the scientific debate is unsettled, and in fact, these are Hollywood liberals and liberal scientists just trying to scare you. On the other hand, George Will follows this playbook very exactly as well in his columns for his conservative and Republican readership at major newspapers and then on shows like ABC News This Week. So how have environmental groups and some political leaders like Al Gore, even some scientists have tried to counter this frame of scientific uncertainty and unfair economic burden? Well, they've gone almost to the opposite extreme in some cases and focusing really on what I call a Pandora's box or a catastrophe frame. And this is a great example from this magazine cover here of Time magazine. And what this focuses on are the dramatic consequences of specific climate impacts, such as more intense hurricanes. And the problem here is that the error bars for each one of these climate impacts remain a lot greater than the specific phenomena of human activities contributing to greenhouse gases leading to global temperature increases. And this interpretation or this frame leads to a counter-argument from people like Inhofe that environmental groups, journalists, and scientists, and Al Gore are just engaging in a form of alarmism, leading the debate back again, once again, to scientific uncertainty, what Chris in his book calls paralysis by analysis. And so what do you find in the opinion polls? You find what I call two Americas of public perceptions. And this is just one example, but you also see this across other survey organization results such as Pew. And what you find is really a 20, 30, 40 percentage point gap between Democrats and Republicans and whether or not they accept the science of the issue in other polls, or in this case, how worried they are about the issue. What you can see is in these survey trends is that really the ability of the White House to set the agenda and the frame on the issue. You can see that this gap, even before 9/11, increased when the White House changed hands from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration. And over the last year with Al Gore's movie, if anything, Democrats have become more amplified, more urgent, not only in these polls, but in other poll findings that I've looked at, and how they view the issue, whereas Republicans remain relatively unactivated. So here's the question. How do you go beyond the frames of scientific uncertainty and unfair economic burden? And how do you activate that Republican base and it's not a politically controversial statement to say that the American public should be paying attention to the issue of global warming and taking it seriously. Yet polls show that, for example, in terms of political importance, the issue of global warming polls dead last among Republicans. Even among Democrats and independents, it's among the bottom third of political issues. So how do you come up with a different interpretation that might mobilize or increase attention and acceptance of the urgency of the issue among that Republican base? One is to focus on citizens' religious identities. And this is part of a campaign that evangelical leaders and other religious leaders have joined with scientists to recast the issue as really a moral question. In their argument, they say, look, the Bible teaches us to be stewards of the environment. You have a Christian duty to take this issue seriously and to take personal and, in some cases, political action on the topic. And in fact, in a very sharp contrast to the tactics and strategy of Richard Dawkins, E.O. Wilson, in fact, uses this argument in his most recent book, The Creation. Having grown up a Southern Baptist, he writes an open letter to religious Americans saying, look, scientists and religious Americans share the same interests. We need to take the environment and global warming very seriously.
It's appropriate for Matt to end on global warming because another reason that this idea about framing resonated for me based upon my own personal background was that even as I was getting into studying Matt's research, I just completed another book of my own about the relationship between hurricanes and global warming, and that book ended up providing a case study of how the rules of scientific debate change once scientific information gets swept up by the media and by the political system, and how important framing is in that context. And I'd like to, in brief, share that story with you, because I think it's a very instructive tale, showing both how scientists who are unfamiliar with the media can really get burned by it, but it also ends as a more hopeful story. So the issue of the relationship between hurricanes and global warming has actually a long scientific history, but it wasn't until the 2005 dramatic hurricane season in the Atlantic that it kind of exploded to public attention. And that was because not only did we have 4 Category 5 storms, not least of them Katrina, but there were 27, 28 total storms in the Atlantic, so many that former National Hurricane Center Director Max Mayfield likes to joke that they had to start naming them after fraternities. And so we had Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, Epsilon, Zeta, and so forth and so on. Amid all of this record year, not 1 but 2 scientific studies came out in leading journals saying that hurricanes had measurably intensified on average, and this was closely correlated with rising temperatures of the ocean at the sea surface, and therefore by implication global warming. One study from MIT's Kerry Emanuel showing an increase in the power dissipation of hurricanes closely correlated with rising sea surface temperatures, and another study by Peter Webster and colleagues from Georgia Tech showing just an increase in the number of Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. Meanwhile, even as scientific studies were saying that hurricanes were intensifying, what did we see but the most intense hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic? This is Hurricane Wilma, featuring what the forecasters call the dreaded pinhole eye on October 19th, 2005. Minimum sea level pressure 882 millibars, the lowest ever measured in the Atlantic basin. As a result of both the weather and the science, the media coverage pattern to this issue, the relationship between hurricane and global warming, resembles, kind of, the wind speed measurements of a tropical storm that meanders sort of weakly along for several days and then suddenly hits a patch of warm water and rapidly intensifies to Category 4 and 5 strength. As a result, there's so much attention to this issue that the cyclone, the image of a cyclonic storm itself, becomes a new symbol of global warming, and I think that's epitomized by the poster for Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. Now, I call this an inconvenient poster because hurricanes rotate counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, and I'm not sure what Al Gore was going for here. I showed them this in Melbourne, Australia at the Bureau of Meteorology, and they got a real kick out of it when I said Al Gore was maybe doing a shout-out to the southern hemisphere. But it doesn't really matter, right, because which way the storm is rotating. This is what Matt calls a frame device, and in this case, it's the Pandora's box frame, again, or perhaps Pandora's smokestack. And Al Gore is signifying by this image that hurricanes equal global warming and that you should be alarmed. But in fact, in the world of science, a huge battle was going on over the validity of the results that I've just cited. And so as a result, we get a kind of case study of what happens when you add a vehement scientific debate together with a media feeding frenzy. And what happens is pretty shocking to scientists. So journalists start mucking around on this issue. They cover it even in 2006 when there's not a lot of dramatic weather, unlike 2005 in the tropics. And they cover it when there aren't a lot of scientific papers coming out initially that follow on the previous papers. So what did the journalists do? They started focusing on drama, individual personalities of scientists, and conflict. And this exacerbated the argument between the scientists, and the fight actually got quite personal, I think, in large part because of media coverage. And it's epitomized by a Wall Street Journal front page story where the journalists are applying a conflict frame. And here's the headline: Hurricane debate shatters civility of weather science. Worsened by global warming, spats are so tempestuous, sides are barely talking, charge of brain fossilization. So it's a journalistic controversy frame, and the message that the public gets also has a strong element, again, of this familiar scientific uncertainty frame, because scientists are fighting, scientists disagree. What's a common citizen supposed to think? We don't know. And the scientists themselves were really shocked, not only by the media feeding frenzy, but also by the tensions that arose as a result of it. And as the Webster team later wrote in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, even senior scientists are ill-prepared for their first major experience with mixing politics, science, and the media. But finally, and happily, I think, the scientists involved in the hurricane global warming debate on both sides of the issue actually reached across the aisle and decided to actively try to reframe the issue. In July of 2006, they released a joint statement in which they defined what Matt and I would call a middle way frame. So it wasn't about scientific uncertainty anymore. It wasn't about conflict, because they were agreeing, and they said, while the debate on hurricanes and climate change is of considerable scientific and societal interest and concern, It should in no event detract from the main hurricane problem facing the United States, the ever-growing concentration of population and wealth in vulnerable coastal regions. So in other words, give us 5-10 years, we'll sort out this scientific argument, but in the meantime, uncertainty doesn't have to translate into inaction because there's some brain-dead obvious things we can do to protect ourselves from the hurricanes of today. We are very exposed, we are very vulnerable no matter what global warming is doing. And then if the storms get 5, 15, 25, 50% worse, once we figure that out, we can add to our defenses, but let's just get ourselves ready for the storms of the present. So it's a middle way approach, and it gets us out of the trap of scientific uncertainty and lets us proceed forward with productive policy action. I think there are two lessons here, and the first one is a lesson, they're both lessons for scientists, but the first one is that it can happen to you. Who knows what tomorrow's controversy is going to be? Who knows where the next media feeding frenzy is going to erupt? It may be your field, and will you be ready for that to happen? And the second message is that now more than ever, as the publication of these two studies in the middle of hurricane season shows, scientists simply, by doing research and then publishing it, have the power to drive public discourse and to shape societal decision-making. And science is only going to become more crucial, not less, to decision-making, to policy in the future, in the 2008 election cycle, and beyond. In this context, we have a problem because many, not all, but many scientists do still cling to this idea that they can just put the facts out there and the facts will speak for themselves and we'll all be better off for it. But the evidence that Matt and I have presented, I think, overwhelmingly shows that the facts do not speak for themselves. And if the facts are all we have, we won't necessarily be better off because the facts are going to get attacked by advocates. They're going to get twisted by politicians. They're going to get misrepresented or not covered or excessively covered in the media. They're going to get, in some cases, suppressed by government agencies, which was the problem in the Republican war on science. Scientists and science defenders, we should be outraged by this. We should complain about it. But at some point, we're also going to have to go beyond that. We're going to have to take active steps to counter and prevent it and to ensure that knowledge translates, because we can't just assume that it will. So now I'll turn it over to Matt to end quickly with some suggestions for how we can do that.
Again, as I said earlier, we conceived of the speaking tour that we're doing as really trying to raise a national conversation about new directions in science communication. So we have a set of immediate proposals that we think might work and start to set things in motion. But in fact, part of this tour is actually a listening tour. So we're generating ideas and hearing ideas while we're out on the road talking to people. The first recommendation that we have is take advantage of the social science research in framing and media influence. As I suggested earlier, previous research generalizably, kind of deductively, suggests that there are a general set of social meanings that play out across science policy debates. We've talked about here just the examples of evolution, climate change, and stem cell research. But down the road with nanotechnology, you can probably see these same interpretations playing out with nanotech. If plant biotechnology rises into more focus, especially now with the approval of animal cloning by the FDA, again, these interpretations might suddenly become very salient, and then public resistance might ensue. So figuring out how different segments of the public are going to come to make sense of a complex scientific topic, what kind of latent meanings from literature, from culture, from history, that might be generated by focusing events that they're going to draw upon, and which one of those meanings resonates with their social background. Again, it's like nuclear energy. In the wrong hands, like the Discovery Institute and their PR campaign on intelligent design creationism, it can lead to very bad effects. But in the right hands, while remaining true to the science, framing can be a very effective tool to engage that wider American public who otherwise may never pay attention to the issue, or simply always default back on their ideology or some other type of social disposition to make sense of these issues. The second recommendation that we have is to go beyond the media and take advantage of community leaders, especially church leaders, to reach non-traditional audiences for science information. Not only community leaders and church leaders, but in fact, actually everyday citizens, what I call science navigators. These are people that have a stronger interest and enthusiasm for science, and importantly, have a strength of personality where they're willing to pass on information to others. So imagine, for example, with a forthcoming IPCC report or a National Academies report that might come out. You have recruited volunteers across social groups and communities across the country who instead, at work, instead of saying, hey, did you hear about the hockey game or the football game, say, hey, did you hear about the IPCC report? Again, you generate a conversation about a scientific topic that then motivates the recipient of that conversation to maybe seek out more information online, and it also, in fact, translates that scientific topic in a language that otherwise disinterested citizen is familiar with. A second recommendation is if you're going to reach a wider American audience, you have to get into local television news. All the polling shows that local TV news remains the dominant source of information about public affairs and health and science for the wider American public. In fact, more than 60% of Americans say that local TV news is their #1 source of information. If you're going to get on local TV news, you have to have scientists on the ground in these local media markets. They have to be there prepared to be on local TV, and you have to have a coordinated national message on these national issues. The third thing is that you can take advantage of film to engage not only a mass audience, as Al Gore did, though selectively mostly a Democratic audience, but importantly, to use film to target a selective audience. Here's a great example that's in contrast to Gore's movie. This example is a documentary film called The Great Warming. In this film, they not only focus on the science of global warming and interview scientists and travel around the world to look at climate impacts, but also interview religious leaders who deliver that moral message. And in screening the film, they've used the Passion of the Christ model. They've actually rented out theaters and had churches go and watch the movie in the theater. And what's important about a movie? Well, you can create a policy forum, a public discussion around a movie, because you show the movie, people come out, you invite different stakeholders and diverse members of the community, and then you have a discussion afterwards, which probably reduces a lot of the polarization, and people come away with a better understanding of the scientific topic and the policy issues, and a better understanding of how their community members feel about the topic. A second set of proposals is really focused on dealing directly with the media. And one thing that we want to hammer home is that science writers are not the problem. If there's any group of journalists that are professionalized, it's science writers. Oftentimes they have advanced degrees in science. They often see issues as scientists do, and on average they do a very good job. In fact, it's when coverage spills over from that science beat, where it reaches an audience of science enthusiasts, and the traditional audience for science and popular science, that communication breaks down when it becomes covered on the cable news networks, on political talk radio, on local TV news, in the political debate, the political pages, in the opinion pages. Instead of focusing narrowly on science writers or complaining about their coverage, focus instead on editors. Editors are the ones that assign the stories. They're the ones that you have to reach. If there's any problem with science writers, it's that they're losing their jobs, in fact. So editors are the ones you have to reach to really translate the message that it's incredibly important to have specialists on your news staff that understand the background of these issues and can cover it and contextualize it in a way that simply isn't always false balance. He said, she said, I'm clueless. The other thing you can do is, besides dealing with the journalists where they are now, actually building into journalism curriculum courses on scientific reasoning. I'll just use an example. This is a course that I actually started and taught when I was at Ohio State. And this is a course that uses a case study approach to teach all public affairs journalism majors, not just science and environmental journalism majors, the principles of scientific evidence and how to, importantly, figure out who's an expert and how to make sense of competing studies and the types of political claims that often get into otherwise scientific debates. And then finally, this is a recommendation that Andrew Revkin uses, and that's go beyond the tyranny of the news peg. And what this means is that instead of defining what's newsworthy in science by the release of a single scientific study, right, we need to start providing more context on science in terms of its political implications, its policy implications, and its ethical implications. What's one way we can do that and make the job easier for journalists? Well, when a very important scientific study comes out in a major journal, not only do you release that scientific study, but the editors actually commission separately a peer-reviewed study that focuses either on the ethical implications or, from policy experts, the policy implications. Now journalists have two parallel news pegs to cover not only the science, but also the policy and ethical context. And then our final set of recommendations is, if you're going to make any new changes in new directions in science communication, you have to change culture. If you're going to change culture in science, you have to change incentives. So the first thing that we recommend symbolically, because Carl Sagan rhetorically in everyone's mind remains the icon of science communication, we argue that in many cases scientists have to take communication as seriously as they take research. One way to generate a discussion and attention to that idea is to induct Carl Sagan into the National Academies in honor of his lifelong dedication to reaching a wider American public. The second recommendation we have is that there's legislation that's been introduced by Representative Doris Matsui in the House that's now part of the NSF authorization bill that's going to conference that would create those incentives for scientists and academics to focus on new directions in science and communication. Specifically, grants that might be designed to have doctoral level training for doctoral scientists in communication skills and communication research, have a better understanding of their audience and how to reach them. And our final recommendation is something that can change very quickly. Again, if you have a division of labor on faculty where once maybe you get tenure, some faculty members will have a heavier component where they focus on science education courses for non-majors and wider public outreach. But one thing you can change right at the college level to try to increase the level of scientific citizenship in this country is to change the nature of how courses for non-majors is taught at the college level. And this would include a very strong media and popular science component. Because if you think about it, when non-majors leave these science courses, how do they continue to engage with science throughout their lifetime? Well, it's by way of the popular media. If you can introduce all the rich sources, many of these rich sources of popular science media into a class and socialize students into enjoying using these media, then after they leave these non-major courses, you have a better chance of not only them actually paying attention to science coverage, but also having a sense of science media literacy where they can make sense of these competing claims that often get into coverage. Thank you. We look forward to your questions.
If we have time for them. We do? All right.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Herb Lynn from the National Academies. There's a sense in which your presentations, I mean, it's deep, it's profound, and it's very depressing. Because what I heard you say, I think, and please tell me if I'm wrong about this, is that it's not only the frames that shape the issue, but it's the person's ideological predisposition that affects his receptiveness to the message. Okay? So all of those frames that you provided up there are all very good, but for any issue, you could take that, for any issue, I could pick one frame and my opponent would pick the other. So given all of that, how is it possible to change people's policy preferences in terms of the answer that they want? And I didn't clearly hear something like, what I sort of heard was, you got to, the people who are over on the other side, forget about them. Okay? Go for the guys in the middle. That's sort of what I heard, and I don't know if that's an accurate reflection of what you said.
I'm going to let the professor answer this one.
Well, first of all, framing is not all powerful. You're really, with a really well-coordinated media campaign, with a shift in the interpretations that are out there in media coverage, you might shift public opinion on a controversial topic 10 percentage points, 15 percentage points. Or within a group, the shift might be 10, 15 percentage points. You're not going to convince everyone. The second thing is that what we're recommending, in fact, actually, is to use framing to actually communicate with the wider American public in a way that resonates with the values that they have. Some people, like George Lakoff, are thinking about how can we actually change people's values over 30 or 40 years. What we're actually suggesting is how can you work with the values that people have and communicate a complex issue in a way that makes it personally meaningful to them. And a great example is on climate change, the reframing of the issue around religious morality. So in that case, what you have is you have a completely deactivated Republican base on the issue of climate change. It polls in political importance behind flag burning and the estate tax as a topic of concern. And that in part is because of the frames that many leaders in the Republican Party are setting, and those are very powerful frames around scientific uncertainty and unfair economic burden. So how do you get around those frames and then communicate the issue in a way that resonates with a very important part of that Republican base? Well, you recast the issue in religious terms and say, no, this is not a question of scientific uncertainty. No, this is not a question of economic burden. This is really a question of being true to the Bible and what the Bible teaches us about environmental stewardship. Another example with climate change. How do you engage maybe a moderate Republican base that's very concerned about economic growth and, in fact, economic potential in investment, maybe the readership of the Wall Street Journal. Well, those are stories that are really looking at the investment potential of a cap-and-trade emission system, and that this might actually create investment opportunities where people can make money. Suddenly, now you have a moderate Republican base of readers of the Wall Street Journal that are paying closer attention to the issue of climate change because it resonates with their own personal interests or how they are a very strong part of their worldview.
I'll just add one point. Yeah, framing is not all powerful, and we recommend adopting framing techniques in combination with improvements in science education and other attempts to change what increase people's knowledge about science on a long-term basis. Framing, in many cases, is a more short-term solution, and that's why Matt has studied its effect in the context of elections or proposition campaigns. Things of that sort.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah. So
okay.
Following up on that, sort of, I'm very sympathetic to the whole approach. One question I have, though, that you sort of alluded to, is the journalists that you're actually talking to. And I have very limited experience with that, but it is different talking to a journalist who's writing for the science pages and a journalist who's writing for the political pages. And my sense has been that as somebody being interviewed, I have very little control over how the journalist decides to frame the stories. Are there any strategies we can use to influence the frames that they actually choose to adopt?
Well, I don't know if Matt wants to take this.
Well,
but
as a political journalist.
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly if you're more aware, you're already a step ahead of many scientists who don't know that there are distinctions between different kinds of journalists. This is a surprise to them. So if you know where the journalist is coming from, you're starting in the right place. And then, you can say, well, I can tell how you're framing this story, but that's going to be unfortunate because, and you can actually have different interpretations to suggest that are not scientifically inaccurate. But one journalist, one story, you can't. If they've got something in their head, you're probably not going to be able to make them get off of it. Once a journalist thinks they know, because it's hard enough to figure out how the heck I'm going to frame this in 6 hours. So once they've got it, it's hard to let go of it. But if there's a broader communication campaign, and it's successful, it will be reflected in media coverage and public opinion.
I would say it depends on the context. If you're going on TV and you're sitting down for a local TV news interview or you're on cable news, you have to walk in with 2, at most 3 key points that you want to get across. And you want to, in fact, actually redirect questions back towards those key points and keep repeating them over and over again for the TV context. On the other hand, oftentimes you'll get a political journalist who might be interviewing you who you sense is going to engage in some type of balance. They're going to call up the other side. And you might say, look, I know that probably your editor is pressuring you to make sure that there's balance here, but if you are going to balance this, make sure you include this statement. And a great example of that is the coverage of intelligent design. Cornelia Dean, in her coverage, she was very good at contextualizing the scientific support for evolutionary science. And you might, as a journalist, say, hey, actually, Cornelia Dean or another journalist you think did a really good job of covering this recently covered it this way. And she used this short paragraph to include the context.
I disagree with Matt on this.
I just wanted to point that out. What's that?
Journalists are competitive. Don't tell them what.
Well, sure. I mean, look, journalists are competitive, but they're also
already
trying
in
to do
disagreement. It's the second talk.
They're trying to do their job. They're trying to. If you can make their job easier, if you can give them ideas and make their job easier, saying, I know you're not going to use what Cornelia Dean used, but take a look at how she did this, right?
This has been a terrific presentation. You've emphasized the importance of the social context affecting how scientific information is received. As someone who's spent a career in education, I think we've done an atrocious job in promoting scientific literacy in the American public. And the question is, if, obviously this is a hypothetical, but if we did a better job, is it possible that that could offset some of that social bias? Do you think?
I'll take a brief crack. I think that if we had a better educated public, we would be better off in any number of ways, including these. But I'm very well educated, I think, about the scientific subject that I write about, but just like any other member of the public, if you take me out of my area and you ask me complicated policy questions on, let's say, the minimum wage, or let's say prescription drug coverage under Medicare, then suddenly I'm a cognitive miser. Suddenly, you know, I'm making decisions, unless I really study up, in the absence of information. So I don't know if you can get the public fully informed about the vast diversity of scientific subjects that exists. In fact, most scientists are not informed about fields other than their own.
Yeah,
Well, I'll let Matt
I think, you know, it's very interesting. Over 30 years of public opinion research on science topics has kind of moved in a different direction. And it actually is an interesting study coming out that's a meta-analysis of studies of the influence of scientific literacy on public opinion about science. And what the meta-analysis actually shows is that, yes, there is a slight positive correlation across studies between scientific literacy as measured, knowing the facts of science, and very kind of a few questions on how science works as a process. But it's a much stronger impact on public opinion of people's religious identities, their partisanship, their ideology. And again, you know, it also begs the question is, you know, we don't think of people with political expertise knowing more about politics necessarily leading to one direction of opinion. So it's not as if the more you know about politics, the more likely you are to vote Democratic, right? In fact, some of the greatest opponents of issues like plant biotechnology know the most about it and the science, right? So really, you always come back to this interaction between ideology and information and how it's packaged. And if anything, I think investment in science education remains important, but it's not necessarily about translating facts that then serve as a shield or a filter on people, how they make sense of issues, but rather really socializing a worldview. And that's really a 30 to 40 year process. And I'll just leave you, the great paradox is that more and more people, levels of education have increased over the last 20 or 30 years. We have more information available to us about science at any time in history, online, et cetera, yet scientific literacy remains roughly the same. And again, it's about motivation and ability to use that information.
Thank you very much. We're going to end the session. Thank you, Matt.